Good to see you again.
You too, man. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm glad to I don't or haven't gone to church very much, but it's nice to spend Sunday with you and try to think about what it might mean to be able to return to church or to some understanding of the divine that allows us to feel like religious again.
Yeah, back to the experience of cathedrals, even if we don't go back to the actual cathedrals.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is kind of in some ways, an incongruous follow-up to our last talk, but I see them as pretty continuous because we sort of looked at the political dimension of religiosity, and then you've got to put the God or the sacred in there somehow.
Right. And where to start, right? Like, what is God even? And it's most obviously a word. It's a symbol. It's something that modern people say they believe in or they don't believe in. But I think the first obstacle when we try to talk about this is I think modern people have an idea of God and of religion and how people who we call traditional or pre-modern, how they used to be religious, how they used to believe in God. And I think that's an anachronism. I think actually if we want to understand religion more authentically, we have to put that modern idea of religion as belief in something kind of to the side and instead approach religion as, and we talked about this last time, it's a practice, it's something you do. And it's less about the knowing of information or the believing in a fact or facts or data or something. It's more about transformation. It's not about the communication of information. It's about the transformation of souls. And modern people we have the individual. We don't really have a conception of the soul, though. And we don't have a conception of God either as modern people that really accurately depicts what pre-modern people were doing. So that's the first obstacle. What do you feel about that framing?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that if you want a better understanding, then you need to go to something like a metamodern or integral framework, and that's going to involve stages or different overlaid cultural operating systems. And your idea of religion and your idea of God and your idea of the soul has to be something that operates in all of those descriptions of reality. You can't just go with either one version or somebody else's critique of that one version. So whatever God is, whatever religion actually is, has to be operating in the archaic, indigenous, traditional, modern, and postmodern settings in order for it to be an authentically meta-level analysis of what those concepts mean.
Right.
But I think you're right at the beginning, you talked about it like, God is a word. And so that has the classic, logos metaphysics to it, but it also gets to the heart of a linguistic problem is the word God even enough to start a conversation with? I sort of think there's three language issues, and one of them is we don't know what we're talking about when we talk with other people about God, right? And some people might mean a finite super being, other people might mean an inherently infinite being. And if the definition of something is both finite and infinite, right, those concepts couldn't be farther apart. You really can't talk to somebody about God unless they're willing to put that word aside and describe to you what they're talking about. So that's the first problem with language.
Right.
The second problem is that the traditionalists and to some degree the modernists have had a book cult going on. That it's understandable when there was one book, and the way you thought about God was the guy who wrote the one book, which is also the world, and he's also the king, and that's perfect for a kingdom in which there's one book. And when you go forward into modernity, there's still a lot of that. There's still a lot of thinking of God as something that's written in some book somewhere, or the author of some book somewhere. And when you drive by churches, Christian churches anyway, they put their favorite sentences up on billboards on the side of the road. Like it couldn't be more explicit that they're book worshipers.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, but that's only a very small subset of human religiosity that did it in terms of text. So we can't we can't conflate text-based religions with religiosity in general, or the God of texts as God in general.
Right.
But I think there is this old philosophical argument, right? Descartes did a really good version of it, which says, in fact, God has something to do with language, that there's a root piece of syntax that makes all other grammars possible and self-consistent. And if you don't have this principle, the super node, the ultimate name in the language that is self-authenticating and lends authenticity to the meanings of other meanings, then no meanings have any meaning, and nothing can be discussed. So insofar as anything is intelligible, the process of intelligibility, which is analogous to a language, has to be rooted in some self-authenticating superfunction of language. So in that sense, you could say, well, the word God is God, in a sense, and people have made that argument. So those are my first three takes on the language problem.
I appreciate that. So it's as if, yes, God is a word. I think that's a good place to begin any conversation like this, because that speaks to each level of each structure of consciousness, in the sense that a postmodernist hears, oh yes, God is a language game. A modernist hears, oh yes, or the postmodernist hears God is a power play of some kind, like religious language is an attempt to assert power over. The modern person, might just, oh right, God is a belief. It's a book that I don't really, I have other books and I don't need to read just that book. And the traditionalist will hear the logos. And there's another way of looking at the evolution of consciousness. It's not in opposition to the integral frameworks that are out there, but it emphasizes media technologies, and there's a way of tracing the history of God by looking at different media technologies. With primal tribal people, you have predominantly language based around rhythm and single utterances, and you don't yet have like a sentence structure yet. So it's an oral culture, right? And God takes on a certain form in that context. And then when you get at least the first script and writing, not yet printing, but writing, you have a elite class of scribes that's able to encounter the divine in a slightly more abstract way. But then once you get like the printing press and the King James Bible, a whole new form of religion based on belief, I think that's when you get this modern conception of God. And then, for the early modern scientists, it was more like God as designer rather than as a deity proper, who's concerned with human day-to-day interactions and human conscience. But so, given that we can approach the word God from many different levels, different perspectives, maybe one of the ways I would propose that we spend our time this morning or afternoon for you. Are you in Montreal or Toronto, or where are you?
I'm in Ontario.
Ontario.
But it would still be like a day and a half drive to get to Toronto from here.
Gotcha.
It's a very wide province.
Yeah. So maybe the best way for us to spend our time is to think about what an integral God might be. And maybe it's not even possible for us. Maybe we're so mired in a postmodern mosaic of fragmented worldviews that we can't even yet pretend to know what an integral God might be. But well, yeah, maybe that's what I want to do, is pretend we know and see what happens.
Well, I think an integral God is always going to have these two, like it almost has a left-right kind of thing. Because on the one hand, it's the God of each of the levels. And then on the other hand, it's the God of all levels, like what's consistent and what's different. And those have to come together somehow. Right. Like you're saying, like there's the classic distinction between in the kingdom God is a creator king and lawgiver, because laws were invented back then. Right. In the modern sense, deists have been like, oh, God's a mathematician, geometer, architect, something like that. So each world space has its own God. And the integral God needs to legitimate each of those, but also specify something that runs through all of them, gives rise to them, but isn't identical to any of those versions.
Right, right. And
I would say has to meet the other characteristics of integral, right? It has to be a God who is amenable to apprehension through all of the basic states of consciousness, as well as through the levels. A
Right.
God that might have significance for different developmental lines, that kind of thing. So all the parts of the map would be connected to the convergent super being.
I like that. So in a way, we need to. It's a process of recovery of all of the different ways of feeling and imagining and thinking about God. We need to find a way of reconciling them and perceiving them as part of a larger totality. I mean, earlier you were talking about the problem. One of the problems with trying to language God is this dichotomy between the finite and the infinite. They seem to be completely irreconcilable, and belief in God forces us, or the belief in God, or the fact that we cannot avoid talking about God is like, it's I think rooted in this tension between the finite and the infinite. The fact, and Descartes, as you were talking about, was brilliant in his ability to articulate this in a way that I think still speaks to our contemporary consciousness. When he journeyed inward to find a secure foundation for his scientific knowledge as well as his religious belief, where he landed was this sacred utterance, I think we have to say, I am. The fact of his own, and the act actually of his own self-consciousness, and the capacity to say I am, where it allows us as finite creatures to participate in at least a little bit of this divine creative power. We create ourselves by uttering this sacred word, I am, right? And that's a gift from God, Descartes says, but it's a power that God has given us and that we exercise. But for Descartes, like, what was this divine idea that he was talking about? It was the infinite, I think. And he says, hey, look inside yourself. You have an intuition of the infinite. God isn't out there somewhere in nature. You're not going to find God. You're not going to have proof of God's existence out there somewhere. Descartes said, look within yourself. If you know yourself as a free being, and most human beings seem to be able to say, yeah, I'm a free being. I do what I want. Don't get in my way. This is, most of us know that we're free. And Descartes then says, well, if you know that you're free, where did that freedom come from? And as soon as you reflect on that question, you are intuiting the infinite divine ground of your own existence. So you find God through that inward meditative move. And once you've made the move that Descartes is prescribing, it's hard to deny what's revealed, like phenomenologically what's revealed. And just because you have an intuition of this infinite within you, this infinite divine ground within you, it doesn't mean you know everything about it, in the way that you might know everything about the natural world or, this exterior dimension. And so then Descartes kind of, without wanting to fully say it or admit it, was undermining the whole Catholic Church's claim to all this knowledge about the way heaven works and what God wants. He was being careful not to say all of that explicitly because he wanted the Catholic Church's blessing. But he wasn't himself, and he didn't think that religious dogma, as it existed at that point, really knew much of anything about the divine infinity within us. We needed a renewal of expression, I think Descartes would say, of what the divine ground is. And that seems to be why we have to make this distinction between religious institutions and mystical experience. And all of the, there's a whole tradition of heretical Catholic mystics, who, like Jakob Böhme, he was becoming, he was, caught up in the Protestant Reformation, obviously, in Central Europe at the time, but he was just having direct insights into the nature of the divine ground that in some ways was in concert with Catholic dogma, but in other ways was radically democratizing, radically like individualizing of the, what God is actually calling human beings to do. So anyways, I guess I wanted to riff a bit on what Descartes brings into this, because it's essential for having a conversation with modern individual people to look at God in this way.
Well, if I boot up my integral lens, I think a number of different features of the model are pertinent there, right? Because Descartes at a moment where there's a transition to modernity, but he's also talking, I would say, about a causal mysticism as opposed to a subtle mysticism, where the church has been offering a phantasmagoria of archetypes as a way of relating, and Descartes is putting that aside and looking only at these
Yeah.
infinite, invisible, infinitesimal logical structures that are equivalent to isness itself.
Hmm.
And at the same time, there's a notion of the individual versus the community, where I think there's a process we can describe whereby individuals undergo spiritual transformation, but there's an inherently interpersonal dimension to religion.
Mm.
Descartes is a bit
Yeah.
focused on the individual. He's focused on himself.
Right.
But I think we also have to look at what, not just how you make contact on your own, but how something analogous to that occurs between and among people as well.
Right.
But the way
Definitely.
I'd first look at that subtle causal distinction, because I think that's where Descartes is most profound in looking at things that are as provable as math is what he's looking for, right?
Hmm.
That's where his focus was. A geometric-like proof of something. So what can I
Right.
trust? I can't trust any actual experiences because they could all be tricks.
Right.
I can only trust fundamentally that some kind of cognitive process is going on,
Hmm.
because I can't get out of that in my doubting moment, and
Yeah.
therefore something exists, right? Therefore the I am exists, and it's, I want to say, maximally self-similar without making an absolute claim, right? Because you
Uh-huh.
could say, right, I think therefore I am, but how do you know that first I is really the same as that second I? You don't, but
Yeah.
there's no two things that are closer than those two. So it's
Right.
maximally self-similar without claiming to be metaphysically absolute. That's how I would be cautious there. But then he
Total.
would say, how do you see make that leap to God from there? You go, well, I think what he's saying is something enables the
Hmm.
syntax of being to achieve indefinite degrees of authenticity.
Yeah.
Right? So that, why is it possible for something to equal something? Why can I be myself in the same sense that two ones is the same as two? Where does equalsness come from?
Hmm.
There's an unbounded perfection to that.
Hmm.
There's a maximum provability capacity in reality, and I think that's what he's calling God to some degree. And wherever anything is demonstrated or is intelligible or is proven, that's a gift of God, because the principle of provability and intelligibility has to predate that. It's like the self-authenticating intelligibility is the spider in the infrastructure of the causal syntax of being.
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, and this is why we need to upgrade Descartes' metaphysics. He, as much as he's usually held up as the one who broke finally from Aristotle, the medieval scholastics were just obsessing over, what Aristotle wrote as if he finished the knowledge project. And, Descartes usually the one given credit for saying, let's just put Aristotle to the side. And his meditations on first philosophy is kind of like, again, he's not explicitly criticizing Aristotle in that book, just like he's not explicitly dismissing Catholic dogma, but he's pulling the rug right out from underneath them. Because after the discourse, after meditations on first philosophy, like it's really the preparation for understanding his new physics, which is very different from Aristotle's physics. But despite everything he's doing to pull the rug out from Aristotle, he's still a thinker of substances and their properties. His understanding of the soul is like this, his understanding of nature and natural objects. And so that's a metaphysics, substance-based metaphysics, that doesn't work when you consider the current state of psychology and the current state of physics. We know that the soul is not some substance, and we also know that matter is not some kind of substance. A lot of times we still talk as if matter was a substance, but that's a shorthand that anyone with a basic understanding of quantum theory or relativity would know that when they talk about particles now, it's not like a little BB ball or something, as Newton might have imagined it. So we need to upgrade Descartes. We need to get out of his individualism and find a way of connecting with the infinite, not just within ourselves, but together in an intersubjective shared space, probably a ritual or ceremonial space of some kind. The whole Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution, the political revolutions that happened around Descartes' time were tremendously individualizing in their effects in various ways. They individualized our relationship to God, they individualized our relationship to nature, they individualized our relationship to the economy, and all of that was healthy at the time, but it also 500 or 400 years later is pathological. It has become pathological, and so we do need an entryway back into the public performance of religiosity. And that can be really frightening because that could take many forms, some of which could be called oppressive. But there's no way out of this, really, because if we don't do it consciously, if we're not religious in an explicit, open, direct way, then we do it unconsciously. And that's what I think, consumer capitalism it's the civic religion of the United States and the Western world. It functions as a religion, but we deny it as religious, and we still label something else as religion. And like capitalist political economy is just a perfectly secular, rational, scientific way of it's like the best we can do with our animal nature is to organize society like this. It's just as if it's just a technology, like capitalist economics is just a technology that we use to manage the world from a position of rational superiority or something. When really it's one of the most, it is a religion that has come to dominate not only most human beings on the planet, even people who may still be Muslim or participate in a more traditional mode of life that kind of exists, at least on the periphery of the capitalist world order. Like they're under threat. I mean, what is Islamic terrorism if not a response to the threat of the global domination of, the capitalist market? It's like they don't want to be subsumed into this religion. And if you're not in it, it's clear to see it as a religion. It's only for us inside of it that it seems like it's just again, some kind of a science or a technology that we're using to manage the world from a position of religious neutrality. So one of the reasons I think it's important for us to develop alternative, more integral conceptions of the divine is to allow us to then see the capitalist political economy for what it is. And it's easy to regress to a traditional point of view to view capitalism from the outside. I see that happening a lot. I mean, it gets called traditional postmodernism or postmodern traditionalism or whatever, as if it's also incorporating the pluralistic sort of green value mean. But there's got to also be a trajectory that's progressive. I know I'm being polemical by calling this the regressive move, but is there a way of becoming religious again in public that doesn't involve a coercive imposition of order upon people who don't see the world the same way or see God the same way? Is there an inclusive, diverse, pluralistic way of being religious in public? Maybe is another way to phrase the question.
Yeah, and there certainly is for people who are naturally well established in that kind of thinking and feeling on their own, right? You could get a bunch of people like that together and they could do public religiosity, but whether that's a public religiosity that could equally be applied to other people who are at other cognitive developmental stages is somewhat uncertain, especially if they're at stages that are primarily organized around social coercion.
This point is really important. So it's as if you're saying, tell me if this is what you're saying. It's as if to do that pluralistic public religion, you need to have gone through the Cartesian stage of individuating your connection to the divine. And only after you've secured that individuation can you then step back into community and not be stuck on some particular image of God that you're going to argue with other people who have a different image of God about. But rather you can, is that
I think it's close to what
Okay.
I'm saying.
Anyways, I
I'm a little
interrupted you.
reluctant. I'm always cautious about this idea of this alternation between individualism and collectivism throughout
Yeah.
developmental stages. I think that's a bit of a misreading.
Uh-huh.
I think you do have to go through. I think you do have to become modern in
Right.
order to basically accept that the same religious practice and the same God is available in multiple cultural and language formats. I think that's an international modernist observation that the
Right.
modernists start going, oh, there's just a lot of ways of talking about the same one God. And then if you keep going, you get an even more rich pluralism, which is, we mean a whole bunch more diversity than just 4 or 5 different major ways of talking about the same God.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you can have a pretty healthy or unhealthy public version of religion at any of the levels. But the one you're talking about, I think you have to be at least eco-pluralistic to pull
Mm-hmm.
that demonstration off, which means
Right.
you have to have solidified your basic modern skill set first,
Mm-hmm.
which means you have to have broken away from your uh, automatic embedding in cultural tradition or in that level of your own cognition. Even though
Yeah.
you may have kept some of those terms and some of those instincts with you, you've wrestled yourself out of a simplistic role-based universe,
Exactly. Or you've
or deepened your understanding of it to the point where it's as if you're outside of it, even though you're still acting it.
yeah. Or I mean, what do you think about in order to have an integral relationship to God, let's say, I think part of incorporating these prior evolutionary achievements is to internalize, like, you now have to be shaman and priest and scientist and pope. Like, those are roles within you that allow you to perceive the divine from many valid perspectives within yourself. I mean, this gets back to the individual community thing. um, I appreciate your problematization of any simple sense of an oscillation, between these as you move through the value memes or the structures of consciousness or whatever. Because again, metaphysically speaking, one of the ways we need to update Descartes, this is why I'm into Alfred North Whitehead. I think he gives us exactly the software patch we need to get Descartes out of his substance-based thinking into a, rather than substance property, it's process relational metaphysics in Whitehead. And once you're there, you see that actually all individuals are themselves communities, like our own identities through time. The I am in this moment is not the same I am in the next, but there is some continuity there. There is some community, some real sense of intimate bond between each moment of our stream of conscious experience as selves. Like we are selves, but I am legion, right? That's how a demon puts it in the New Testament. But there's a way in which that's true for all of us. Like Walt Whitman later would put it in his poetry that what does he say? I am large, I contain multitudes. So each of us is already a community, and that allows us to break out of the privatization of the soul that you get from Descartes, back, and so that we can step back into a public form of religiosity.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with that. Although I would say that you can have public forms of religiosity at that Descartes level, they're just going to
Mm-hmm.
look different and be imagined as a bunch of individuals coming together.
Yeah, yeah,
So that this post-formal, this green level where everything that previously looked like one thing is understood to be a networked plurality, that's a great level, and it allows us to see that pattern fractally echoed at every scale we look at, and that should, I think, embolden us to act collectively
yeah,
based on the fact that we have an interior collectivity.
right.
That thing about Legion interests me a great deal because of that. In the developmental sense, it's very easy to see that a fragmented plurality is different than an integrated plurality.
Right.
Right? You're not just, even though you might have, in the Cartesian sense, a pure syntactical self-reference that is consistent throughout all of your manifestations.
Mm-hmm.
your general being isn't like that. Your general being shows up as fragmentary. We have subselves, we have left and right, we have conscious and unconscious, or maybe chakras, or maybe there's a myriad of different proto beings that make up our psyche, and we don't even most of the time have the courage to experience the cognitive dissonance of seeing our own internal contradictions. But when we do, we understand there's an evolutionary possibility of becoming a more whole and integrated being. That unity is something to work on, not something that's magically pre-given, except in its most minimal possible sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that distinction. There is fragmentation of a multiplicity of roles or personas within us, and that's madness. But there's also a way of being in the process of unification of that multitude that holds them together. The unity isn't something pre-given. Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a movement towards deeper integration, even while along the way we are always made in community. We are made. Soul making is a process, and so one of the things that draws me to traditional religious forms is that they seem to me to be primed for soul making, which is a process. This is James Hillman's term. He's borrowing it actually from the Romantic poet John Keats. This notion of soul making, as the soul is not something pre-given. You don't just, it's not just an eternal substance. It's something you cultivate. It's something you construct through these. You can use psychotechnologies. You can use cultural practices. You can use books. But religion, traditional religious forms, offer us avenues to soul making, and you can easily become fixated ideologically, and that's not soul making anymore. That's thumb sucking. But if you've achieved a sort of postmodern consciousness, you can, I think, return to traditional religious forms in order to and ritual forms too, not just reading texts, but participating in a Catholic Mass, for example. They can afford soul making, that a depth of soul making that's not really available in the marketplace elsewhere. I mean, there are a few pockets maybe, but it's all very experimental. But these are tried and true, like tested methods of soul making and soul formation. And so there's a way in which and this is happening in Buddhism, where their psychotechnologies, say, of different meditative techniques are being sort of almost extracted out of the cultural and cosmological context in which they were first imagined by Buddhist practitioners and monks and stuff, and put into a modern context. But they're still valuable soul-making technologies. I think we also need a way so I'm making a distinction here between the ritual technologies, I suppose is a way of putting it, and the cosmological backdrop, right, in which those technologies were originally plugged in and discovered and maintained. Do you think that's a valid distinction?
I think something like that has to go on if you're going to look at it from a meta level, because there's, on the one hand, a evolutionary cultivationist orientation in which God is something like the vanishing point around which we organize integration and convergence of all of our parts to create something that's greater than the sum of our parts, with which we can enter into a relationship that we might think of as first, second, or third person. Yeah. But there's also something in the structure of reality that makes that even possible, right? Something like a pre-existing convergence point that holds the possibilities of reality together and which is implicated in our production of convergence. And the mythological way of thinking about that is that we're producing a soul, or that there's a cosmology in which these entities exist. Right? You could strip that down at modern and postmodern levels and get really ephemeral about it. But if you were going to paint a picture of it, it would look like the cosmology painted on the side of a Renaissance temple.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they were really good at that when they were functioning well, right?
Mm-hmm.
You go to traditional things, not all churches, not all rituals are giving people anything. A lot of people go their whole lives through traditional ritual practice and get almost no inner nourishment out of it. So it's very particular to whether the individual context is operating right. But when it is, you get that effect of when you look up at the inside of the cathedral dome in a great church and you see the paintings of all the beings spiraling together around this unfathomable power of light. That sort of convergence, done individually is soul making, and done collectively, I think, is God making. It brings forward a numinosity. We perform the apotheosis collectively and give ourselves access to that power if we can integrate our parts properly.
Right.
But you could also say that there is something in the structure of reality that allows that move to occur in the first place. And we might want to call that God, or we might want to say God is whatever it is when we bring it forth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know how Whitehead solves this problem is by having, some people say he has two gods, but he has a primordial and a consequent nature of God. And the primordial nature of God is sort of, it's like the cosmological ground for order. And that God isn't one that human beings need to participate in making. Like, it's the God that allowed human beings to even emerge in the first place. But then there's the consequent nature of God, which is that which in human beings compels us to build cathedrals so that the nature of the divine can be made manifest to a conscious animal on the planet Earth. It's like that's the side of God that we participate in bringing forth. But there's also this other side of God that brought us forth. And somehow they're the same God. And whether or not we can think those two, the primordial and consequent natures, as the same God is a question that I still ask myself, even though I find Whitehead's vision compelling. But yeah, there are these two aspects to the divine, like the creator, including the creator of ourselves as the being asking the question about God, and then the God that clearly is something that is synthetic in the sense that we make it through our ritual performances, and that it dies if we stop if we cease performing and participating. God dies.
I think fundamentally religion's role has been to embody and preserve the practices that lead to the production of God. And that the religious philosophers have tried to articulate what is that pre-existing necessity that involves into the process. And I think, integral theory, it has a reasonably good set of tools for mapping that if it wants to. Right? You can say there's a minimum set of involutionary givens that are called upon in the evolutionary process, which either succeeds better or succeeds worse in calling forth this transfiguring numinosity. And if this were to continue succeeding over time, it would build up to more sophisticated levels, which increasingly approximate the pattern inherent in that involutionary given.
Yeah.
And that this is occurring in all of the state domains. It occurs differently in the different cultural stages. So I think there's a way of saying both, and also saying what happens as they interact with each other, right? That the primordial God and the generated God increasingly approximates the primordial God, at least in its underlying pattern. And that may be a process that can never reach its conclusion if we take absolutism out of the system and just say it's endlessly self-approximating, but it would endlessly self-approximate through more and more impressive levels. I think God is the primordial God is holographically distributed into the holons, and they can move up that scale. And there's another interesting question there, not to deviate completely, but the heaps holons distinction is relevant to me. Because it's a different thing to say God is everywhere and God could be anywhere, right? That if an atom and a cell and a person are holons, but a pile of dirt is not a thing, it's a bunch of things. Each of those things embodies this divine pattern in the degree to which it is capable, which won't be as capable as a higher stage is, but the whole pile isn't the presence of God. Each of them is the presence of God. So God could show up anywhere, but isn't necessarily equally distributed in all places that we can think of.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important distinction. And for me, theologically, the heap hole distinction can be rendered in terms of personality. Does a pile of rocks have the same degree of personality as a chipmunk?
Or even as an atom within a rock.
Or even as an atom within a rock? But then the question becomes interesting, like when you look at the way that Navajo Indians related to mountains. Certain piles of rocks end up having more personality than other piles of rocks, even though we're still talking about a matter of degrees here. And so evolutionarily speaking, if there is a divine ground that's holonically or holographically repeating in each individual, it's going to repeat at a different intensity depending on the personality that the individual is capable of incarnating. And at least in many of the religious stories of creation and among human beings, it seems like we chose ourselves as the being most capable of incarnating personality at the highest intensity. In Christianity, this takes the form of, I think, the Christ being as the most incarnate divine personality that is possible on this earth. I think that's the idea. And that we as other human beings, we're supposed to try to live up to that potential for personality to take root, to like unify the multitude without coercively squashing the plurality, but just calling it. It's the difference between, personality is powerful not because it's coercive, but because it's persuasive. It pulls the many into one because the many are loving it.
Sure. I think the avataric characters, real or legendary, represent for us the integrative flourishing of our character, indefinitely approximating divinity. And I think that's probably an archetypal function that comes built in, right? And that one of the things the God-man does, whether it's a historical legendary God-man or whether you fall at the feet of a guru of some kind, is I think you have the option of entering into a relationship with that figure who you perceive as approximating the human divine in a way that activates your own tendency to start developing in that direction, even though you're almost genetically pre-given that option, in the same way that the future of your hair will go through several stages that are already built into your DNA when you get it. I think one of the DNA options we have is a kind of mutation of our form in the degree of the divine towards the divine human. And I think you're right about personality, and I think that this touches on first, second, and third person lenses in integral thinking, right? That we can, on the one hand, apply that to anything, right? You can apply it to a pile of dirt and have something like a personal relationship with that pile of dirt, even though you might be doing most of the work. And that may be true of the universe as a whole, right? Is the universe as a whole actually a whole, or is it a bunch of things? And we could have a relationship to this bunch of things, or to emptiness or fullness, and we can deal with that as a self or an other or a thing. But some of the things have this built-in holonic tendency to be, they do at least half the work when we have a personal relationship with them. One hand, I could think of God as, say, the second person relationship between myself and absolutely everything. But if I think of this syntactical nexus of convergent reflux into reality that I was describing, I think that has the character of being personality-like. It goes out of its way to make a second person relationship available, and that we might say that our capacity to be persons is a holographic distribution of its person-like attribute.
That's wonderful. I mean, so one way of getting at this notion of personality is to ask what distinguishes personality from wholeness, as we might think of it abstractly. Like, to say the universe is a whole could mean the universe is a system that like all of its parts are functionally related to all the other parts as part of this total system. But that's kind of abstract, and the notion of personality, I think, brings something to the wholeness that's not just system, but it's life. It's a growing, responsive, intelligent entity. It's not just a system that's sort of running automatically, you know. And the thing with the first, second, and third person ways of getting at the divine is all three of those are persons. And personality, literally, person means a mask through which sound passes. And I think what we're getting at when we talk about personality is not just like the personality of one distinct individual. To be a personality is to be a mask through which sound passes. In other words, to be able to resonate interior to interior by inhabiting spaces of meaning, or achieving the resonance between beings that allows meaning to be generated. That's what it means to be a person, you know, to partake of personality. It's always relational, individual, and holistic at the same time. It's all of these in co-presence. And it's the difference between a religious and a scientific view of the universe, I think. Do we see the universe as a system that's just operating automatically? Or do we see the universe as not just a system, but a person? Is there a soul present in this system? Is it alive, or is it just a machine? Is it on automatic? And maybe God has left, or it assembled itself somehow, you know. And this isn't to begin opposition, but
is the person-like attribute of the manifest universe something that's integrated or capable of integration, right?
yeah.
If I think of someone like Nietzsche, he's very clear that he organizes reality around a subjective intentional function, that all manifestations of energy are accompanied by a will for energy to converge and flow and discharge, a will to power, an empowerment drive. And so that every manifestation of the universe is accompanied by a subjective aspect, but those subjective aspects are not necessarily pre-assembled into a singular personality, but they might all be examples of a flowing proto-personality, which, if integrated over time, increasingly demonstrates the characteristic of personality.
Yeah, that's great. So this is like Teilhard de Chardin saying that God is not behind us, but up ahead of us, you know, and we're evolving towards it. Maybe.
You do have to assume there's something behind us that allows that to occur, right? Like a minimal primordial God enables the evolutionary attractor God to perform its function.
Yeah. I mean, I guess Nicholas of Cusa maybe would talk about the implicit and the explicit gods, where, yeah, there's something implicit at the beginning, but it's not fully unfolded until the end. And maybe beginning and end are themselves just abstractions from a process of continuous eternal creation. And, you know, we don't need to arrive at God because we never left, but somehow we engage in that story of fall and redemption or nirvana and samsara and the wheel of karma. We engage in these stories because that's what God does, maybe. You know, I wonder what you think of you know, oftentimes scholars of world religions will talk about how the West and the Judaic and Islamic and Christian religious streams seem uniquely obsessed with history, the sort of temporal unfolding of a particular sequence of events, a narrative form. Whereas in most of the Asian religions, you get more of this sense of, yeah, maybe there are cycles of time, but ultimately it's like there's more of a sense of the eternal existence, eternal being, and there's no interest in a historical process whereby the end is going to be this grand revelation. It's just, no, we're already here. We never left. Like, what is that distinction? Do you think it's just some strange, like, Western idiosyncrasy that we need to get over, or is there something to it?
I think there's a positive and a negative aspect to it. Right? There's a positive aspect whereby, right, there was a group of people somewhere in the Near East. And they really had a great role in bringing forth alphabetic consciousness and driving forward the knowledge project and the individuality project. And they tended to migrate west. And where they went tended to become the technological dominant center. And if they went further, the dominant center moved further. So there's a lot of benefit evolutionarily to what happened there. But it's equally possible to read the Middle Eastern monotheistic phenomenon as an aberration, as a pathological version where something went wrong and the normal mode of amber culture and religion got broken, right? And we know that that culture has inherited a lot of domestic and then social evils, right? Not that evils weren't all over, but the kind of murderousness that's been associated with the monotheisms, regardless of their rhetoric, has been pretty extreme. As well as, you know, do we think the Catholic style abuse of children is limited just to Catholic Christianity and it's not rampant through Islamic countries and things too? There's some kind of rot there, and it may be because they're downstream of a particular historical and environmental trauma that happened in that region. People have made that argument. If we think about it that way, we could say what you're dealing with in Western monotheism is a truncated or somewhat suppressed version of the normal mythological membership culture. And in normal mythological membership culture and religion, there are these endless several thousand year cycles of creation and apocalypse. And in the Western version, you basically have that, but they're only looking at this chunk. It starts at the beginning of this cycle, and they kind of, at the beginnings of the holy books, there's mention that there were some entities or a little something beforehand, and then the cycle goes into the apocalypse, and there's a little hint that there's going to be something next. But the vision is contracted from the normal mythic vision, which sees all these cycles, and it just looks at this cycle, which might give them an extra incentive to try to gain power and change things in this cycle. But I think it also makes them potentially a non-representative example of mythic membership religion.
Yeah, no, I
Although
appreciate that.
each generation of people is born with your full human complement, so it's never one thing. They're steering in and out of every kind of version of their religions as they go.
Right. I mean, another way of looking at it maybe is that this particular lineage of thought, the monotheisms, with their obsession with history, there was a recognition of a crucial like bifurcation point in the evolution of maybe the whole Earth, maybe just our species, but the evolution of our species is now a planetary catastrophe. So Earth evolution and human evolution are now entwined. Maybe this lineage though was aware of something new that was emerging on the planet that shifted us out of the old agreement among the gods. and they're like, you know, there's a way of thinking about, and maybe this is just my own sort of irrational religious attachment, but it seems like when I read scholars like and mystics like Rudolf Steiner on what the Christ event was as a turning point in the evolution of the Earth, it's compelling to me as, you know, it's, and other, you know, philosophers before Steiner, like the German idealist Friedrich Schelling wrote about this, and the idea that that mythology is an evolutionary process within human consciousness that has its own logic and unfolding necessity, and that the world's various mythological traditions were on a trajectory from their earliest origins that would lead to something like the becoming finite of the infinite, or the God becoming flesh, you know, and that when that takes place, we're in a totally new situation where we're not just in this infinite eternal sphere anymore. There's actually been a disruption that has generated a trajectory where the future is different from the past. There's been an ontological transformation of the very structure of time. It's not just a moving image of eternity anymore. Time is actually something new now. And so it's just another way, instead of privileging, I think we can either look at this privileging the eternalist perspective, the non-dual sort of always already fine perspective of reality, and then this more historical unfolding evolutionary perspective. We can either privilege the one or the other, and if we were to, I think you were privileging the other, and I'm privileging the historical understanding of being now, that maybe something different has occurred.
I think something different has occurred. I think that in many ways, a person like Steiner is looking back through modernity at premodernity, and that there's a change in the appreciation or even the nature of time at modernity and at postmodernity, and that it's debatable whether or not this particular Western religious lineage has played a significant role in developing us into modern and postmodern levels, right? You could almost say, some people would argue that secularism is a uniquely Christian invention.
Oh, yeah.
But on the other hand, that's very parochial in that's where we're looking. That's where we've been looking for hundreds of years in our analysis, and we don't really have a nuanced appreciation of how modernity and the transformation of time out of cyclic eternalism into progress and change might have been naturally unfolding in other cultures that we just didn't pay much attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I sure hope that like the Islamic world has its own unique form of secularism that can unfold out of its lineage, even though all the monotheistic traditions have so much more in common with each other than they do. That's not so. But yeah, I think that it is kind of narrow to just say that secularity isn't necessarily connected to Christianity, as if it couldn't emerge from any other tradition. But I do think there's a connection between the Christian monotheistic obsession with the divine's role in history and modern science and the evolutionary understanding of the evolution of life on Earth, but also the whole universe as a process of cosmogenesis. Like, that's a very ironically, as much as the creationists fight against the evolutionists, I don't think the evolutionary understanding of the universe could have really emerged in another culture than the European Christian culture, because of this notion of the importance of history, and how somehow God as an eternal being had a plan for time to unfold in a certain way.
If you look at the unfoldment of complex algorithms, you find that a lot of them replicate the same patterns, coming at it from very different angles. So I think it's difficult for us to know whether or not a similar phenomenon could have emerged out of a different set of historical circumstances or not, right? There's certainly, looking back, we can see there are parallels to contemporary understandings that are nested in the mythic understandings of our ancestors, right? Even things like, it's not hard to see the line between the God-man and the sacredness of the individual, or between the idea of being equal before the throne of God and the idea of just being equal as human beings. Or between the idea of killing our God on a cross and then the idea that God is dead and we might not need to worry about that so much, right? You can draw all kinds of lines, but could you draw lines to the same place from other starting points? Probably.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, history is full of contingencies, and I wouldn't want to arrive at any preconceived understanding of how it had to be, when certainly it could have been it could have occurred in different ways. So do you think, in what we've talked about so far, that there might be anyone who was listening coming from a particular center of gravity culturally that they would have been triggered by? Is there anything we need to address to sort of include some folks that may have felt alienated by the ground we've covered so far?
I don't know. I think if they understood all the things we said, they probably would be triggered. And if they didn't understand, that would be hard to address.
Fair enough.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean, I know probably that I don't think any traditional religious believers will ever listen to what we've talked about. But if they do, I imagine that they might be triggered because, one of the things I really enjoyed about having a like actual university campus when I was an undergrad was if I just sat on the lawn, inevitably, within 20 minutes, the Campus Crusaders for Christ or some other religious group would come over to me, and 3 or 4 of them would start talking to me about the Bible. And I love those conversations because I have to. It provides me with an opportunity to like play the part of the sort of mythic membership, consciousness. And I usually learn something from them about how that mode of consciousness operates. But I also tried always to not make them feel like I was their enemy by telling them that they were silly or that their ideas were stupid. And typically these folks would leave feeling, I would basically just try to introduce them to the idea of religious pluralism, and that just because these other people think that this being was important and has a lot to teach us doesn't mean that your being is unimportant and doesn't also have a lot to teach us. And that seemed to be the easiest pathway forward into another kind of conversation that might be more integrative. And it seemed to work most of the time. I don't know how long it stuck with them when they left, but it seems like if our society as a whole is going to really be able to shift forward into a more integrated relationship to religion and to God as a word, then we need to get these mythic membership folks into an ability to talk to other people of other traditions in a way that's not like from the beginning requiring confirmation to one's own system, because that gets violent really quick, and the planet's just not big enough for that. And I feel like this is billions of people we're talking about. And so like, I guess the reason I was asking the question about our conversation and who we might have triggered is that we could talk among those who already agree with us, or we could try to find ways to talk to those who relate to God in a very traditional way, to sort of just welcome them into this conversation. And I don't know if we have been welcoming to them. Maybe that's a different conversation we can have in the future, where we try to do some, I guess, mediation between traditional religious believers and, the community of religious practice that we might want to welcome them into, that's more pluralistic, but also more integrated at the same time.
Well, I think we aren't going to get very far unless we cultivate a legion of integral diplomats of various kinds who can, on the one hand, like you're saying, meet people where they are. And it works better in person because you're not just reacting to an unknown comment. You can attune yourself in the conversation to dial up your own mythic capacities and relate to them as just a human being, or even a sacred human being, where you're not so tied to your languaging and you're trying to get them to release theirs a little bit and acknowledge that there might be value in contexts adjacent to them that are similar but different. So you're offering the chance of interparadigmatic expansion in an unforced, non-coercive way. And I think there's also a capacity to enter really deeply into communication with these people by using their language with just an expanded meaning reference in ourselves. Now, I'm thinking of my aunt had a party, and my cousin was there, and the woman who'd been his midwife was there. And my cousin took me aside and said, "I don't want to talk to this woman. All she talks about is Satan and God." And he said, "Can you keep her busy, because she's an important member of the party?" So I went over to talk to her. What I ended up doing was, we would talk about the Lord. And when I said the Lord, I meant the archetypal function available in the subtle apex of anyone's version of reality, right? Krishna is the Lord, Kali is the Lord, Jesus is the Lord. I'm talking about the Lord per se. And she wants to talk about, she has a specific symbolic historical reference point that she's going to. But if we keep that terminology in a way where I can mean something generic and pluralistic, and she can mean something specific, then not only can we talk about it without her being linguistically triggered, but I can learn some things from her specific knowledge set about her Lord that applies to the Lord in general. So I'm gaining insights in that process, and it becomes a very dynamic living exchange. Not because I've asked her to give up her symbols, but because I've simply accessed my largest validity for those symbols within the terms of the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, that's important to be able to, because one thing that can happen that short circuits this diplomatic process is that we, like an atheist refuses to play the language game of the theist. Even though when I watch the atheists and the theists fighting with each other, there's plenty of examples in the atheist language of what I would call the God signifier is operating, just it gets given another label. And so there's a way in which we need to be able to be willing to play one another's language games. Sure. and recognize that that's like the only means we have of establishing like sociality and community is to be willing to play one another's language games. And this is not to say that there aren't hierarchies of interpretation, and that there are language games that are more encompassing than others. I mean, that's the whole work of translation and diplomacy, is learning how to translate language games such that there's an overall movement towards more integration or more depth, more interpretive nuance, because we don't want to get fixated on a particular language game. And so we need to develop a facility for translation. And that has applications beyond religion. It has applications in politics too, obviously. And as we, I think, talked about more last time, there are ways in which the political language games and political ideology functions religiously now. In modernity, in a secular age, like in so many ways, we've replaced religion with politics. And utopianism, modern political utopianism, is one of the most destructive forces to ever express itself on this planet. And so if we do bring religion back in as in a conscious way, maybe we can avoid this sort of utopianism that would lead to mass death and war and death camps and all these things. Because the promised land is it's a state of consciousness, I think. It's one way to put it. And we need to achieve it through love and persuasion rather than through force and inquisition. And so, being able to play the role of diplomat, I think, is one of the ways that we might be more integral about religion and God.
Diplomacy has a gestural, emotional component and a conceptual component, right? One thing is, if you're just in person, not upset by people and not opposed to what they're saying, you don't feel fragile as if your meanings are going to be ruined if this person is allowed to continue saying things the way they like to say them, right? If you don't have that, then you can do the diplomatic function, but you also need to have this cognitive capacity to see that the structures of meaning you're talking about are the same, even if they show up in different languages or different disciplines. Mm-hmm. I think that's a key thing, right? That's what vision logic is supposed to mean. Mm-hmm. Insight structure patterns that are relevant to reality, but don't belong to any particular domain of thinking or speaking.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right about the way that putative secularists still use the God signifier, right? Even the extreme example would be, I believe no God created the universe. I believe no God determines what happens to us. It said, right? And you go, oh, well, this
Yeah.
person believes in God. He just calls him no God. Not really acceptable name of God. That's fine.
Right. Right. Yeah. So it's like sometimes we let our language think for us, when we forget that we're playing a game. And it's not that we can think without language, that would be hard, but we can avoid being entrapped by a particular language game. And this work of shifting and constantly being in that in between space of translation, I think is what allows for us to cultivate deeper modes of consciousness, is that we're not ideologically fixated, stuck within a particular language game. We're remaining untrapped in a particular language game by constantly translating between them.
The dialectic of evolution and health comes up for me a lot, right? There's healthy and unhealthy versions of each of the stages. And then when you look at an individual being trapped in language games, some of that is just that we're all trapped in language games in the degree to which we have a socially acquired personality overlay that is either assisting or thwarting the flourishing of our actual character. Then we could be said to be unhealthy versions of a human being.
Yeah.
I think that's true all the way back. No matter how simple or complex you are, you can be sort of thwarted by your socially acquired knowledge, or that socially acquired knowledge could be like a stained glass window that's still letting the light from your underlying personality come forward. On the other hand, there's a definite sophistication in being able to handle those things and being able to think your way outside of your thought process and being able to say to yourself the ways in which you aren't trapped in the meanings of what you think words mean. There's a sophisticated enfoldment and meta-level nuance that goes on in an ever-deepening, enriching fashion that requires you to practice doing that and takes time to gather your competence in that field. But at the same time, there's always been this recognition that the surface level of thinking and socializing is hollow and false unless it provides an opening to who we actually are. And I think that's true even at very simplistic levels of culture and thought.
Yeah. And, the other thing is that speech isn't just descriptive. It's also injunctive. It's creative. It brings certain things into the world. It compels people to behave in certain ways. And so, this gets us, I think, into another important area that we'll have to discuss some other time. But, there's a way in which speech is dangerous because it's not just a sort of, neutral description. It has a force to it. There's like a fictional force to the way that we speak to one another. And, there's the whole dust up around cancel culture and free speech and all of this is something that desperately needs to be disaggregated and thought through. And I think understanding how we relate to language, how we play language games, and how games, to say that they're games is not to say that they don't have real effects in the world, in terms of people's quality of life, people's very livelihoods, people's, it's a matter of life and death, how we speak to one another at the end of the day. And so this isn't just a game. That's a whole nother subject. But
yeah, that's a good topic. It's got a lot of angles. I don't think we can cover it today. One of the things I'd like to touch on in terms of more consciously bringing religion back into the world is trying to make sure that it's a healthy rather than unhealthy version of religion, right? Yeah. So you could say, yes, the modernist capital market has an ideological force to it that acts as if it's a religion in the world. Why is it problematic? Why isn't that just a perfectly good religion? It's because in a sense, the gods have to be balanced by each other, right? That was the old pagan model. There's a mandala of deities, And maybe they're orchestrated around a convergent central deity or an underlying power. But unless the forces, the powers, are in balance, you're going to get problematic consequences in the world and in the kingdom.
Yeah.
So the God of the market has to be not just acknowledging that there's some other ones, like, yeah, sure, maybe you have some private non-monetary concerns that are meaningful, sure, right? Those other ones have to be equally prominent so that there's a kind of parity between them that allows an overtone to emerge out of their collection. And I think that's the same with us individually, right? I can have my left and right brain hemisphere are always operating, but in moments where they are more balanced, then I have a whole different presence, right? I have a meditative harmony to the way that I'm acting. And likewise, when the different deities in the world are balanced, then we have this different, I think, power that makes health available in the culture. When one of the gods dominates, then we're at risk. The mandala's tipped and everything goes out of whack.
Yeah. You know, the god of the market has overplayed its hand and is eating away at the other god's ability, you know, to exercise the important role. It's so, you know, I think to be critical of the religion of the market, to be critical of the capitalist political theology, is not to say that markets should be eliminated, you know. It's to say that there are other powers that help to constitute healthy human life, coming out of, say, the cultural sphere, the social sphere, that aren't just purely dominated by the logic of money and the logic of exchange. And that if you do dominate culture itself with this logic of exchange, you're actually undermining the ability for culture to manifest. If the capitalist economy and the logic of that God is allowed to dominate medicine and science generally, you end up with all of the funding going to military technologies, or to mediocre treatments for diseases, when actually we have the know-how to create cures, but they're not as profitable. So, you know, we just need to check the power of this God that has. It's like Prometheus, you know, we need to chain Prometheus, because otherwise we have a runaway, self-destroying process on our hands.
You could argue, ecological economists make this argument that credits are a kind of language, and that right now that language only takes its numbers from certain domains, and therefore they wield outsized influence and become imbalanced gods.
Right.
So this the classic example is, I cut down a tree, it's worth 0 credits, I sell it to you for 100 credits, great. The credits that I now have came from our market negotiation. But if we were to say, well, the tree is doing 200 credits worth of work in the forest right now, if you cut it down and sell it for 100 credits, you just lost 100 credits.
Yeah.
Right. And so then the credits language has just included the Gaian deity as well as the market deity. And now you have a more balanced situation, and that principle could be indefinitely expanded.
Right.
But you'd need, right, whether it's credits or not, because you might not want to have a system in which everything is monetized. You need some kind of common language or a sense of an infrastructure in which these different powers would be appropriately balanced with each other.
Yeah.
But how do they speak to each other? How do we help them be relational?
Right. I mean, under the capitalist religion, the interests of many beings are not included in the deliberations around, you know, value and investment. So you have a very small number of billionaires or large corporations who their interests determine the direction that the political system moves in, because that's all that's allowed to be included in the capitalist frame. The interests of trees, of the whole Gaian system, the interests of the working class and the poor, the underclasses, they don't get factored in to the capitalist logic. They're not even, so we don't have to monetize them to include them, but we do need to find some way of representing the interests of all the other beings who aren't part of the capitalist class, because it turns out that most of the value is produced by all of these other beings. And so, yeah, we need a counterbalancing force that I think, if it's going to avoid being violent, not that religions can't sometimes be violent, but I think there's a deeper religious impulse that seems to lean more in the direction of love than violence. And I think that impulse is the one that needs to be activated now, because the pressure is so high right now. The capitalist system, the religion, still, like, nominally people are still practicing it, but more and more it's losing its numinous charge. More people are saying, wait a minute, what are we doing? Why are we worshiping this God? They don't have any alternatives, so they keep going through the motions of worship, paying their rent, showing up for their job that they hate, whatever. But now that we're in the middle of this corona depression, there's fewer and fewer people who do have jobs, more and more people who are hungry, homeless. And so the pressure is building, and the God is losing legitimacy. And so the question is, what is the alternative? Where are these people going to turn for the locus of social energy to sort of guide us into the future? And there's some scary options that I see out there. And I don't have as much clarity about what the positive alternatives are.
Every system, every religion, let's say, seems to exist in a dialectic where it oscillates, not rhythmically, but based on circumstance, between its healthy mode, which I would say is adaptive and inclusive, and its degenerative mode, which is reactive and Puritan. Right? Because it's one of the things it's trying to do is divinize the culture, right? Make the culture function well enough that it experiences itself as holy, and that it's organized around some kind of overwhelming numinosity that causes it to rejoice and empowers it to take action. Mm-hmm. So that's what religion is ultimately trying to do, I would argue. And when it can't do that, it usually diagnoses itself as somehow having a mismatch between homogeneity and diversity. So if it's in a good mood, if it's strong, if it's healthy, it can increase the amount of homogeneity among a diversity. You say, oh, there's a bunch more, there's a bunch of people, there's a bunch of concerns, there's a bunch of new knowledge, there's a bunch of new technology. How can we fold that in and make a new coherence that's capable of giving us organizing momentum? But if it's not in a good condition, if it's deprived or malnourished or traumatized, it will try to fall back to a narrower homogeneity by getting rid of a bunch of the diversity. Mm-hmm. And that's the classic, right? That's the Nazi move. Or just round up people who are too different and eliminate them until we get enough sameness. But it's also it's the sick move. It's the weak move. It says they don't have the plastic incorporative power to create more sameness out of the diversity that they've been handled. Mm-hmm. So if the people are strong enough in what they can enfold and give sameness to, then you get a really flourishing system, even under the conditions of crisis. But if the system is already weak and it doesn't even try to enfold new diversity, if it wants to fall back to an imagined or really existing historical sameness, that's almost always going to produce unnecessary violence. It's going to be a breakdown, which is also to some degree a suicide of that level of the system.
Yeah, I like that way of framing it. So the good news is that we don't need to assume that we have any control over this process. So I think we just need to stay as sensitive as we can be to the subtle textures and rhythms that are trying to emerge, and just keep our surfboards nearby. And I do have, there's something to religion that provides for a sense of like metaphysical confidence. And there's a pathological form of confidence where you assume that somehow like divine goodness is like pre-given. I know we've been critical of that in our conversation, but there's another form of confidence, metaphysical confidence, that can come from hope that it's possible that maybe we can, maybe God can, maybe goodness can help lift us into higher forms of harmonization. It's a faith, confidence as faith. It's not certainty, it's faith, an openness to the possibility that perhaps harmony will win out over discord, and that I am not personally in control of whatever that harmony might be. I have to be open to hearing the call and then participating in the way that I can. And that, that way of understanding what religious faith is, as openness to hearing the call, I think it helps to prevent us from asserting or enforcing a particular ideological form upon others, because that's not something we've heard. That's not something we've been openly receptive to. It's more something that we are trying to impose. So it's a way of maintaining the importance of faith without it becoming, I think, misconstrued as belief or creed, which I think is something that's too fixed on a particular language game. Faith is not fixated within a particular language game. It can't be.
No, it's almost the opposite of that, right? You could make an argument that faith and belief are antonyms, in the sense that belief is trying to give you certainty where certainty doesn't exist, and faith is what makes uncertainty workable.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Which is already a sign that something is going well, right? It means your system is organizing itself well enough to produce this additional hum of the engine that you experience as a kind of unforced faith or confidence, right? Something is succeeding. So then you go, oh, this succeedingness is working. I guess maybe things might succeed, right? So that it's a non-naive hopefulness. It's just based on the fact that you've actually been able to pull off some integration. Just the fact that you're breathing and walking around is a sign that a whole bunch of systems are coordinating to produce something more than the sum of the parts. So if that can happen, and the more that can happen, the more you're confident that those sorts of things can happen in the world.
Right.
Whether God is necessary to that in how we think about it is uncertain. Because if you take this notion of a primordial God, what's the good of that? Maybe as a philosopher, you organize your own mind by thinking about it because you need that piece to make sense of the infrastructure of all the concepts that describe reality for you. But can I throw that away and just say, look, we have some faith, we have some confidence, I do things that create a higher thing in myself, and then I have a relation to it and it changes me and deepens me, and we could do that collectively as well. Is there any need for the primal nature of God in that process, or is the process indifferent to that one way or the other? That's only how some people like to describe it.
It seems to me that pragmatically it's best to assume that the primordial God is not necessary, because that will, if that primordial God is real, allow it to most fully show up in an authentic way, in the collective construction.
That's the opposite of Pascal's wager.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Best not to believe so that it can show up naturally. Yeah, that's good. The reversal. Pascal's wager is everything that I don't like about the modern way of imagining religion is manifest in Pascal's wager. It's like, I really don't think that's how we should be approaching it. So yes, the opposite of that. Yeah. Well, hey, Layman, I think I have a date with the second half of my church experience on this Sunday is with the river. So I think we should probably draw this to a close.
Absolutely. It's been great. Let's do another one on how we relate to language.
Yes. Yes. That sounds good. I won't even start because that'll keep us going for another half hour.
All right. Fantastic. I love this. It's very, regardless of its utility, it's a very happy thing for me to speak of God.
Yes, likewise. I've really enjoyed, particularly wandering together in this divine wilderness that we've been exploring. I really do. I really did enjoy it. So I hope we can continue on another subject in the near future.
Amen.
Amen.